It started with a law meant to save America's soul. When Prohibition took effect in 1920, the government banned the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol. But the law did something no one in Washington expected. It turned ordinary men into millionaires and the streets into battlefields. Speakeasies opened behind every locked door. Moonshine flowed through the alleys and back roads of every major city. The liquor was illegal, but the money was very real. From Chicago to New York, the underworld saw an opportunity too big to ignore. Petty crooks became bootleggers. Bootleggers became bosses. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, organized crime had evolved into a national business. Then came the Great Depression. Banks failed. Jobs disappeared. Bread lines grew longer by the day. For millions of Americans, crime looked less like evil and more like survival. This was the perfect storm for a new breed of outlaw. Names like Al Capone, John Dillinger, and George Babyface Nelson filled the headlines. Some ran syndicates that controlled entire cities. Others robbed banks with a Tommy gun and a smile. To many Americans, these men were folk heroes, rebels who had beaten a broken system. But to the Bureau of Investigation, they were something else entirely. Public enemy number one. At the center of the Bureau's transformation stood a man named John Edgar Hoover. Hoover had joined the Department of Justice in 1917 and climbed fast. By 1924, he was running the Bureau. He was young, ambitious, and relentless. He wanted order in a country that was coming apart. Under Hoover, the Bureau became something new, disciplined, methodical, professional. Agents traded cheap suits for uniforms, sloppy raids for precision work. The mission was simple: dismantle organized crime, one outlaw at a time. And as the 1930s rolled on, that mission would turn the Bureau into one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the world and make J. Edgar Hoover a name feared on both sides of the law. George Nelson didn't look like a killer. He was small, barely 5'4", with a boyish grin that earned him the nickname Babyface. But behind that grin was one of the most violent men of the Depression era. Born Lester Joseph Gillis in Chicago in 1908, Nelson grew up in the rough streets of the city's north side. By the time most kids were still in school, he was already stealing cars and carrying a gun. Reform school didn't change him, it hardened him. By the 1920s, Nelson had graduated to armed robbery. He ran with small-time crews, knocking over banks and stores, always chasing a bigger score. His reputation spread fast. He was fearless, impulsive, and had a temper that could turn deadly in a second. In 1933, he crossed paths with John Dillinger, the country's most famous outlaw. Dillinger's gang was already making headlines for daring daylight robberies, and Nelson fit right in. Together, they tore through the Midwest, hitting banks in Iowa, Wisconsin, and Indiana, leaving a trail of bodies behind. But Nelson wasn't like Dillinger. Where Dillinger was calculating, Nelson was reckless. He didn't think twice before pulling the trigger. Even his partners feared him. After Dillinger was shot and killed outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago on July 22, 1934, the FBI turned its full attention to Nelson. Within weeks, he was named Public Enemy number 1. That title didn't last long. On November 27, 1934, outside Barrington, Illinois, Nelson's luck ran out. He spotted 2 FBI agents tailing him and opened fire. The gunfight that followed was brutal. Bullets ripped through both cars as they skidded along the highway. When it was over, 2 federal agents were dead and Nelson had been hit 17 times. He died that night, his wife Helen Gillis by his side, only 25 years old. George Babyface Nelson had spent half his life running from the law. In the end, the law caught up, the only way it ever could. In the heart of Harlem, during the heat of Prohibition, one man managed to walk a line no one else could, between the mafia and the people. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Most knew him simply as Bumpy. Born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905, Johnson grew up in a country still divided by race and poverty. He came north during the Great Migration, like thousands of others searching for something better. Harlem was his new world. loud, alive, and overflowing with hustle. By the 1920s, Bumpy Johnson had found his calling. He was sharp, well-read, and tough enough to survive the street. When Prohibition turned the city's underworld into a gold rush, Harlem became prime territory, not just for local hustlers, but for the Italian mafia. When mob boss Charles "Lucky" Luciano took control of New York's rackets, he set his sights on Harlem's numbers game, an illegal lottery that had long been the community's lifeblood. Most black operators were forced out. But not Bumpy. Instead of fighting Luciano head-on, Johnson made a deal. He became the mafia's man in Harlem, overseeing operations while protecting his neighborhood's interests. To outsiders, he was a gangster. To many in Harlem, he was something more, a symbol of power in a world built to deny it. Through the 1930s and 1940s, Bumpy's name carried weight from Lenox Avenue to the Cotton Club. He dressed like a businessman, spoke like a poet, and ruled like a king. But like every man in that world, he couldn't outrun the law forever. In the 1950s, Johnson was indicted for conspiring to sell heroin, a charge that would cost him 15 years of his life. He served his time quietly, reading, studying, and waiting. When he came home in 1963, Harlem hadn't forgotten him. The streets filled with cheers, cars honked, people lined the sidewalks to see the man who had outlasted the system. 5 years later, in 1968, Bumpy Johnson's heart gave out while he was having breakfast at Wells Restaurant, one of his favorite spots on 7th Avenue. He died the way he lived, in Harlem, surrounded by the city he helped shape, respected by those who knew his story, feared by those who didn't. In the 1920s, Chicago was a city built on ambition, corruption, and blood. At its center stood one man, a symbol of power, greed, and the cost of both. His name was Alphonse Capone. Born in Brooklyn, New York in 1899 to Italian immigrants, Capone grew up fast. He learned early that in America, respect wasn't given, it was taken. By his teenage years, he was running with street gangs. A knife scar across his cheek earned him the nickname that would follow him for life, Scarface. When Prohibition hit in 1920, Capone moved to Chicago under the wing of mobster Johnny Torrio, who was running the city's illegal liquor business. Capone proved to be more than muscle. He was smart, organized, and ruthless when he had to be. When Torrio retired after an assassination attempt in 1925, Capone took over. Overnight, he became the face of organized crime in America. His empire spanned bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution, pulling in an estimated $100 million a year, an unimaginable fortune in those days. But wealth came with enemies. Rival gangs fought for control of Chicago's South Side, and Capone's war with George "Bugs" Moran's North Side gang became legendary. On February the 14th, 1929, 7 of Moran's men were lined up in a garage on North Clark Street and gunned down by men dressed as police officers. The world called it the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. No one was ever convicted, but everyone knew who had given the order. Capone's empire began to crumble soon after. The violence brought too much attention. Politicians, federal agents, and the press all wanted him gone. But in the end, it wasn't murder that brought Al Capone down, it was math. In 1931, federal prosecutors charged him with tax evasion, proving that even a gangster couldn't ignore the IRS. Capone was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50,000, and sent to one of the most feared prisons in America, Alcatraz. Behind those cold walls, the once untouchable king of Chicago grew weak. He suffered from advanced syphilis, which slowly attacked his mind. When he was released in 1939, he was no longer the man who had ruled a city. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone suffered a stroke at his mansion in Palm Island, Florida. Days later, he caught pneumonia and died surrounded by his family. He was 48 years old. In life, Al Capone controlled an empire of vice and fear. In death, he became something else, a reminder that even the most powerful man in the underworld can't escape the law or himself. They were young, reckless, and madly in love. A pair of outlaws who became legends before they were even 30. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow weren't the first to rob banks during the Great Depression, but they became the most famous. Their story was part crime spree, part doomed romance, and part American tragedy. Clyde was born in Texas in 1909, the son of poor sharecroppers. He grew up hungry, angry, and restless. By his teens, he was stealing cars and breaking into stores, chasing a way out of poverty. Bonnie came from the same hard soil, born in 1910, raised by her widowed mother outside Dallas. She was small, bright, and ambitious, dreaming of something bigger than the life around her. When she met Clyde Barrow in 1930, the spark was instant. Clyde was already in trouble with the law, and prison only made him harder. When he got out, Bonnie was waiting. Together they hit the road armed with pistols, shotguns, and the kind of desperation only the Depression could breed. They robbed banks, gas stations, and grocery stores across Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Louisiana. To the public, they became symbols of rebellion, two lovers who had taken on the world. But the truth was darker. Their robberies were small, violent, and often sloppy. They killed without hesitation, mostly lawmen who got in their way. As their crimes mounted, so did the pressure. By 1934, they were being hunted by every police agency in the region. The break came when one of their accomplices betrayed them, tipping off law enforcement to their movements. On the morning of May the 23rd, 1934, near Gibbsland, Louisiana, Bonnie and Clyde's stolen Ford rolled down a quiet rural road. Waiting in the brush were 6 lawmen led by Texas Ranger Frank Hamer. When the car appeared, the posse opened fire. The first bullets hit before Bonnie or Clyde could even reach for their guns. In less than 20 seconds, the car was riddled with more than 100 rounds. When the smoke cleared, the Barrow gang was finished. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were dead, both 23 years old. Their story became legend, not because of what they stole, but because of how they lived and died, together on the run, in a world that had already decided their fate. In the 1920s, Atlantic City was known as the world's playground. Beneath the bright lights and boardwalk charm, one man quietly ran it all: Enoch Lewis Nucky Johnson. He wasn't a gangster in the usual sense. He didn't carry a gun or rob banks. Nucky Johnson was something more dangerous, a political boss who turned an entire city into his personal kingdom. Born in 1883 in Galloway Township, New Jersey, Nucky came from modest roots. His father was the local sheriff, and by the time Nucky was a young man, he understood how power worked, who to pay, who to threaten, and when to smile while doing both. By the time Prohibition arrived in 1920, Johnson had become the undisputed ruler of Atlantic County. He controlled the police, the politicians, and every inch of the famous boardwalk. If you wanted to run liquor, open a casino, or operate a brothel, you paid Nucky. Under his protection, the city thrived as a haven for vice. While the rest of America went dry, Atlantic City poured the drinks freely. Every hotel, nightclub, and backroom bar kicked money upstairs to Johnson. He wasn't working alone. Nucky's reach extended far beyond New Jersey. He was connected with some of the biggest names in organized crime: Arnold Rothstein, Al Capone, Charles "Lucky" Luciano, and Johnny Torrio. Together, they built a national network that moved illegal liquor from Canada to Chicago to the Jersey Shore. For nearly 2 decades, Nucky lived like royalty: expensive suits, chauffeur-driven cars, and lavish parties at the Ritz-Carlton. But like every empire built on corruption, it couldn't last. In 1939, federal investigators finally caught up to him. Johnson was charged with tax evasion, the same crime that had brought down Capone years earlier. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison, though he served only 4 before being paroled. When he walked out, the world had changed. The days of bootleggers and political bosses were over. Nucky Johnson lived quietly after his release, far from the luxury he once enjoyed. On December 9th, 1968, he died of natural causes at the age of 85. The man who once ruled Atlantic City left behind more than a fortune. He left a legend. A story of how politics and crime once danced together on the edge of the Atlantic, under the glow of 1,000 boardwalk lights. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was the kind of man who could charm you with a smile and kill you with the same hand. He was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1906 to poor Jewish immigrants who had fled the old world looking for something better. What they found was the tough life of the Lower East Side, a place where survival depended on nerve. Siegel had plenty of it. By his teens, he was running with street gangs, shaking down pushcart vendors for protection money. That's where he met another ambitious kid from the neighborhood, Meyer Lansky. Together, they formed the Bugs and Meyer Gang, a crew that made its money through bootlegging, gambling, and contract hits during the Prohibition years. Siegel earned his nickname Bugsy for his unpredictable temper, Bugsy being slang for crazy. But behind that temper was intelligence and style. He wasn't the average thug. He dressed sharp, spoke smooth, and knew how to mix crime with class. As Prohibition ended, Siegel and Lansky moved deeper into organized crime, aligning with the Italian mafia under Charles "Lucky" Luciano. They helped form the National Crime Syndicate, a coast-to-coast alliance that turned crime into business. By the 1940s, Siegel had shifted west, looking for new territory. In California, he mingled with Hollywood stars, lived in mansions, and ran gambling rackets under the radar. But his biggest gamble was still to come. Siegel dreamed of building something that had never existed before, a luxury resort in the middle of the Nevada desert. That dream became the Flamingo Hotel, the first true casino on what would later be known as the Las Vegas Strip. The project was bold but expensive. Costs spiraled out of control, and the mafia investors who had trusted Siegel's vision started to lose patience. Millions disappeared, and rumors spread that Siegel was skimming money for himself. On the night of June 20th, 1947, as he sat in the Beverly Hills home of his girlfriend Virginia Hill, Siegel was shot multiple times through the window. He died instantly. No one was ever charged. Some said Meyer Lansky ordered the hit. Others claimed it was the syndicate settling its accounts. The truth remains buried with him. Bugsy Siegel was 39 years old, a man who lived fast, died violently, and left behind a city of neon lights in the desert. His dream didn't die with him. It became Las Vegas, the capital of chance, built on one man's ambition and another man's bullet. In the dark days of the Great Depression, when banks were failing and families were starving, one man turned crime into legend. His name was John Herbert Dillinger, a thief, a killer, and the most wanted man in America. He was born in Indianapolis, Indiana, in 1903, a restless kid with a wild streak that no one could tame. After a short stint in the Navy ended in desertion, Dillinger drifted into petty crime. But a botched grocery store robbery sent him to prison, and that's where he learned how to be something bigger. Behind bars, he studied from the best seasoned bank robbers who taught him the craft of the heist. When he walked out in 1933, the country was deep in despair, and banks had become the enemy of the people. Dillinger decided to rob them. With his hand-picked crew, a violent outfit the press later called the Terror Gang, Dillinger began a spree across the Midwest. They hit banks in Indiana, Ohio, and Wisconsin, sometimes taking hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time. They worked fast, moved constantly, and weren't afraid to shoot their way out. To a public beaten down by hard times, Dillinger looked like a folk hero. He was handsome, confident, and always seemed one step ahead of the law. Newspapers printed his picture like he was a movie star. Crowds cheered when he escaped from jail, once carving a fake pistol out of wood, another time slipping through a police dragnet in Chicago. But fame is a dangerous thing for a man on the run. By mid-1934, the Bureau of Investigation, soon to be the FBI, had made him public enemy number one. His robberies had turned into bloodshed, and the government was determined to end his story. That chance came on the night of July 22, 1934. Dillinger was living under an alias in Chicago, keeping company with a new girlfriend, Polly Hamilton, and a woman named Anna Sage, known in the underworld as the Woman in Red. What Dillinger didn't know was that Sage had made a deal with federal agents, his life for her freedom from deportation. That night, the three went to see Manhattan Melodrama at the Biograph Theatre. As Dillinger stepped out into the warm summer air, agents were waiting in the shadows. They opened fire. 3 bullets hit him before he hit the pavement. John Dillinger died on the sidewalk outside the theatre that night, 31 years old, his revolver still in his hand. For the Bureau, it was a victory. For the country, it was the end of an era, the death of a man who had turned bank robbery into spectacle, and who learned too late that every outlaw runs out of road. In the violent world of New York's underworld, few names carried the same chill as Abraham "Kid Twist" Reles. He wasn't a boss or a businessman, he was a killer, one of the most feared executioners ever produced by organized crime. Born in Brooklyn in 1906, Reles grew up in the tough streets of Brownsville, a neighborhood where loyalty was survival and violence was currency. By his 20s, he had already built a reputation for brutality. Reles was small in stature, but quick, cold, and methodical. His weapon of choice was an ice pick, which he'd drive through his victim's ear and into the brain, silent, efficient, final. It was that signature that earned him his legend and his nickname, Kid Twist. Reles was a key figure in a group of contract killers that reporters would later call Murder, Inc., the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate. They worked out of Brooklyn, carrying out executions on behalf of mob bosses across the country. If someone broke the rules, owed money, or talked too much, Reles was one of the men sent to make it right, but power built on blood doesn't last forever. By the late 1930s, the law had started closing in. Facing a possible death sentence himself, Reles did the unthinkable. He flipped. He turned state's evidence, naming names, revealing contracts, and exposing the secret machinery behind Murder, Inc. His testimony sent many of his old partners to the electric chair, including some of the syndicate's most dangerous men. Under police protection, Reles was kept in a guarded hotel in Coney Island, the Half Moon Hotel, watched around the clock. But in November 1941, everything came to an abrupt end. Sometime before dawn, Reles's body was found sprawled on the pavement 6 stories below his window. The official story said he was trying to escape. But there were no signs of a struggle, and the ledge outside his room was too narrow to explain the fall. Cops called it an accident. The underworld called it justice. Abraham "Kid Twist" Reles was 35 years old when he died, a man who had once killed without mercy, and who learned too late that in the world he came from, no one ever truly gets away. He was the man who turned crime into an organization, who gave chaos structure and power a system. His name was Charles "Lucky" Luciano, and he built the blueprint for the American Mafia. Luciano was born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily in 1897 and came to New York with his family as a child. The streets of the Lower East Side became his school. By his teens, he was running rackets, dealing drugs, and building alliances with the city's toughest gangs. He rose fast, not because he was the most violent, but because he was the smartest. Luciano saw what others didn't, that the future of crime wasn't in small neighborhood gangs, but in a national network that could cooperate, share profits, and avoid the bloodshed that drew too much heat. In the early 1930s, after years working under old-world bosses, Luciano made his move. He orchestrated the murders of the last generation's leaders, including Giuseppe "Joe the Boss", Masseria, and Salvatore Maranzano, and took control of New York's underworld. From there, he created the Commission, a board of directors for organized crime. It brought together the Italian mafia and Jewish mobsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, dividing territory and settling disputes with business-like precision. It was the birth of the modern mafia, and Luciano was its architect. They called him Lucky because he always seemed to survive arrests, ambushes, assassination attempts. But in 1936, his fortune turned. New York prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey targeted Luciano's empire, uncovering his control over a massive prostitution ring that spanned the city. Luciano was convicted and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. For most men, that would have been the end. But war changes everything. When World War II broke out, US naval intelligence sought Luciano's help. From his cell, he used his underworld connections to secure the New York docks from Axis sabotage and to open communication channels with Sicilian contacts before the Allied invasion of Italy. In return, his sentence was commuted, but freedom came with a price: deportation. In 1946, Luciano was sent back to Italy, barred from ever returning to the United States. He lived quietly in Naples, still respected by gangsters on both sides of the Atlantic, though his power had faded. On January 26, 1962, as he met with a film producer about a movie based on his life, Luciano collapsed at the airport and died of a heart attack. He was 64. Charles "Lucky" Luciano never picked up a gun in his later years, but his fingerprints were on every deal the mafia made for decades. He didn't just survive the underworld, he organized it, and in doing so, changed it forever. He was called the Al Capone of New Jersey, a title that carried both power and danger. His name was Abner "Longie" Zwillman, and for decades he stood at the intersection of crime, business, and respectability. Zwillman was born in Newark, New Jersey in 1904, the son of poor Jewish immigrants. Like many who grew up in the rough neighborhoods of the early 20th century, he learned quickly that money meant safety, and that the fastest way to make it wasn't always legal. When Prohibition began in 1920, Zwillman saw his opportunity. He built one of the largest bootlegging operations on the East Coast, smuggling liquor through the ports of Newark and Atlantic City. His network reached deep into the underworld, but Zwillman ran his business with a calm precision that made him stand out from the usual gangsters. He forged alliances with powerful figures like Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Dutch Schultz, ensuring that New Jersey's liquor rackets stayed under his control. But unlike Capone, Zwillman wanted something more: legitimacy. He poured money into charities, helped the needy during the Depression, and even offered a $25,000 reward for the safe return of the kidnapped Lindbergh baby in 1932. To the public, he was a successful businessman and philanthropist. To the law, he was still a racketeer. As Prohibition ended, Zwillman shifted into gambling, running numbers rackets and slot machine operations across the state. He owned pieces of nightclubs, trucking companies, even Hollywood talent agencies. For a time, it looked like he'd escaped the gangster life entirely. But by the 1950s, federal investigators were circling again. Senate hearings on organized crime, the Kefauver Committee, began exposing the national syndicate, and Zwillman's name appeared among its top figures. Pressure was mounting. On February 27, 1959, Abner Zwillman was found hanged in the basement of his home in West Orange, New Jersey. The official report said suicide, the stress of investigations, and ill health finally catching up to him. But the scene raised questions. Bruises on his wrists suggested he might not have tied the rope himself. Some believed the mafia had silenced him before he could talk. Others said he'd simply reached the end of his long double life. Whatever the truth, Abner "Longie" Zwillman's story ended the way so many in that world did, quietly, mysteriously, and alone. He had spent a lifetime trying to look like a businessman, but in the end, the shadow of the underworld never really let him go. He was never the loudest man in the room, never the one pulling the trigger. But in the world of organized crime, Meyer Lansky was the one who made the numbers work. They called him the mob's accountant, but that title barely scratched the surface of who he really was. Born Meyer Suchalyansky in Grodno, Russia in 1902, Lansky came to New York as a boy, another immigrant chasing the promise of America. What he found instead were the crowded tenements of the Lower East Side, a place that taught survival fast. It was there he met two men who would define his life, Benjamin "Bugsy" Siegel and Charles "Lucky" Luciano. The three grew up together, fighting on the streets, running small-time rackets, and dreaming of something bigger than corner hustles. While Siegel was the muscle and Luciano the strategist, Lansky was the mind. He understood the mechanics of money, how to move it, clean it, and multiply it. When Prohibition opened the door to organized crime, Lansky was already thinking ahead. In the 1930s, he helped Luciano build the Commission, a national syndicate designed to organize the mafia and its allies like a corporation. It ended the bloody turf wars of the old world and turned crime into business. Lansky wasn't Italian, but he was trusted. His connections ran from New York to Chicago to Havana. His specialty was gambling. Lansky built a vast network of casinos, first in Florida and New Orleans, then in Cuba, where he turned Havana into a playground for the rich and the corrupt. When Fidel Castro's revolution later seized his casinos, Lansky lost millions overnight. But even then, he stayed calm. For him, money always found a way home. He kept his operations clean, his records hidden, and his public profile quiet. The FBI knew who he was, but could never make the charges stick. He was investigated for tax evasion, money laundering, and racketeering, yet he walked away every time. In the 1970s, Lansky fled to Israel, claiming citizenship under the law of return. The US pushed for extradition, but Israel refused, citing lack of evidence. Eventually, Lansky returned to Miami, old, tired, but untouched. On January 15th, 1983, Meyer Lansky died of lung cancer at the age of 80. He left behind an estate valued at only a few $100,000, at least on paper. Authorities believed he had hidden hundreds of millions offshore, though no one ever found it. Meyer Lansky never wore the crown, never fired the shot, and never went to prison. But in a world built on crime and chaos, he proved something rare: that the quiet man with the ledger could be just as dangerous as the man with the gun. He was known by many names: the Mad Hatter, the Lord High Executioner. But in the streets of New York, everyone knew what Albert Anastasia really was: a man to fear. Born Umberto Anastasio in Tropea, Italy in 1902, he came to America as a teenager and settled in Brooklyn, where poverty and violence shaped him quickly. By his early 20s, he had already been convicted of murder, but the conviction was overturned and Anastasia walked free. It wouldn't be the last time luck was on his side. In the years that followed, Anastasia rose through the ranks of organized crime. He aligned himself with powerful figures like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, men who were turning the chaos of the underworld into a national enterprise. Anastasia became their enforcer, cold, efficient, and loyal only to power. When Luciano and Lansky formed the mafia's enforcement arm in the 1930s, it was Anastasia who helped run it. Reporters would later give it a name that fit all too well: Murder Inc. Operating out of Brooklyn, Murder Inc. handled the syndicate's dirty work, executions, disappearances, and messages sent in blood. Anastasia wasn't just a trigger man, he was a commander. He ordered killings across the country, ensuring the mafia's rules were enforced without mercy. His reputation for violence earned him his chilling nicknames and kept his enemies quiet. As the years passed, Anastasia moved beyond enforcement and into business. He controlled powerful gambling operations, and by the 1950s, he was one of the top bosses in the American mafia, head of what was then known as the Anastasia crime family, later the Gambino family. But in the underworld, power never stands still. His unpredictability, his temper, and his ambition began to make other bosses nervous, especially Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino, two men who were quietly plotting to reshape the mafia's hierarchy. On the morning of October 25th, 1957, Anastasia entered the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan for his usual shave in the barbershop. He sat back in the chair, eyes closed, the towel still warm around his face. Moments later, two gunmen stepped inside and opened fire. Anastasia was hit multiple times, collapsing into the mirror, a reflection of his own violent life shattering in front of him. The killers were never caught. The hit sent shockwaves through the mafia world. It wasn't just the death of a man, it was the end of an era, the fall of one of organized crime's most feared executioners. Albert Anastasia had ruled with blood and fear. In the end, that same fear came for him, as it always does for men who live by the gun. In the lawless years between the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression, a man named Albert Bates carved out a place for himself in America's criminal history. Not as the flashiest outlaw, but as one who understood how to survive when crime itself was changing. Bates was born in 1893, and by the 1920s he had become a seasoned bank robber and burglar, traveling from state to state with a rotating cast of partners. He knew how to pick locks, crack safes, and disappear across county lines before the law even knew what had happened. But as the decade wore on, the country began to change. Bank robberies, once easy money for desperate men, were getting harder. Law enforcement was growing sharper, more organized, and better armed. That's when Bates joined forces with a man whose name would soon become infamous, George "Machine Gun" Kelly. The two men formed a dangerous partnership, moving from one failed heist to the next, looking for a new way to make a fortune. They found it in kidnapping. In July 1933, Bates and Kelly targeted one of the richest men in Oklahoma, Charles F. Urschel, an oil tycoon from Oklahoma City. On a hot summer night, the gang stormed Urschel's home, forcing him at gunpoint into a waiting car. The victim was blindfolded and held at a remote farmhouse while Bates and Kelly negotiated a $200,000 ransom, an enormous sum at the time. But Urschel was no ordinary hostage. He paid close attention to every detail, the sounds he heard, the smells, even the feel of the ground beneath his feet. When he was finally released unharmed, he passed that information to the FBI. It was enough to lead agents straight to the gang. Within months, Bates was captured and brought to trial. The government, eager to make an example, convicted him on federal kidnapping charges. He was sentenced to life in prison, marking the end of his long criminal career. Albert Bates spent the rest of his days behind bars, quietly fading from the headlines that had once celebrated men like him. In 1948, he died of heart disease, far from the roads and robberies that had defined his life. He was one of the last of his kind, a professional outlaw who lived through the age when the gunmen of the Depression finally met the full force of modern law. He was called the Brain, the man who turned the underworld into an enterprise. Arnold Rothstein didn't rob banks or pull triggers. He made money move, and in doing so, helped invent organized crime as America would come to know it. Born in New York City in 1882, Rothstein was the son of a well-off businessman. But even as a boy, he was drawn to the risk, the numbers, and the thrill of the bet. He wasn't interested in honest work. He was interested in odds, in angles, in control. By his 20s, Rothstein had become one of the city's most powerful gamblers and loan sharks, running high-stakes poker games and betting operations across Manhattan. He was calm, calculating, and almost never lost. People said he could turn chaos into order with a pencil and a ledger. Rothstein wasn't a gangster in the traditional sense. He was a financier for those who were. He bankrolled bootleggers, gamblers, and racketeers, often taking a cut of their profits in exchange for capital and protection. When Prohibition hit in 1920, he saw the opportunity before anyone else. He quietly invested in liquor smuggling operations, gambling halls, and racetracks, building a criminal empire that operated with business-like precision. But the act that made him infamous came before all that, the fixing of the 1919 World Series. Though he was never convicted, Rothstein was widely believed to have orchestrated the scheme to pay Chicago White Sox players to throw the championship against the Cincinnati Reds. It was the scandal that shocked the nation and forever tied his name to corruption on a grand scale. By the late 1920s, Rothstein was still powerful, but cracks had begun to show. He had enemies, debts, and partners who no longer trusted his calm demeanor. The gambling tables that had once made him rich became the stage for his downfall. On the night of November 4th, 1928, Rothstein attended a high-stakes poker game at Manhattan's Park Central Hotel. The game turned ugly. Hours later, he was found near the hotel's service entrance, shot in the abdomen and bleeding badly. When police arrived, they found the poker game still going, the players refusing to leave, the chips still stacked on the table. Rothstein, barely conscious, refused to name his shooter. He died 2 days later at the age of 46. His murder was never solved. Some said it was over a gambling debt. Others claimed it was retribution from men he'd double-crossed. Whatever the truth, Arnold Rothstein's death marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The men he once mentored, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Bugsy Siegel, would go on to build the modern mafia in his image. Rothstein had taught them the rules: keep your books clean, your temper cold, and your business profitable. He turned crime into a system and paid for it with his life. He was loud, dangerous, and proud of it, a man whose name became a symbol of the gangster era. They called him Machine Gun Kelly, after his weapon of choice, a Thompson submachine gun he carried like a badge of honor. His real name was George Kelly Barnes, born in Memphis, Tennessee in 1895. At first, he wasn't much of a criminal, more of a drifter, dabbling in small-time bootlegging during Prohibition. But when he met Catherine Thorne, his second wife, everything changed. Catherine had ambition, and she saw in Kelly the potential to become something larger than life. She bought him his first Tommy gun, dressed him sharp, and started spreading stories of his exploits. Together, they built the legend George Kelly, the fearless machine gun bandit who could rob a bank in broad daylight and vanish before the law even knew he was there. Throughout the early 1930s, Kelly moved from bootlegging to bank robbery, working across the Midwest with a rotating crew of gunmen. But as federal law enforcement grew stronger, bank robberies became riskier. That's when Kelly and Catherine turned to a new racket: kidnapping. Their target was Charles F. Urschel, an Oklahoma oil tycoon known for his wealth and routine. On July 22, 1933, Kelly and his men stormed Urschel's Oklahoma City mansion, forcing him into a car at gunpoint. They took him to a farmhouse in Texas, where he was held for ransom while blindfolded. But Urschel was no ordinary victim. Even with his eyes covered, he memorized every sound, every smell, every clue that could identify where he'd been held. When the ransom, $200,000 in cash, was paid and he was released, he gave the FBI enough information to track Kelly's every move. Within weeks, agents captured George and Catherine Kelly in Memphis, ending their brief reign as outlaws. According to legend, Kelly threw up his hands and shouted, "Don't shoot, G-men! Don't shoot!" giving birth to the nickname still used for federal agents today. Both George and Catherine were sentenced to life in prison for the kidnapping of Charles Urschel. Kelly spent years behind bars, including time in Alcatraz, once sharing a cell block with other infamous gangsters like Al Capone. He grew old in prison, far from the spotlight he and his wife had once chased. In 1954, George Machine Gun Kelly died of a heart attack at Leavenworth Penitentiary. He was 60 years old, a man who had built his own myth with gunfire and bravado, only to be undone by one victim's calm memory and one wife's dangerous dream of fame. In the violent streets of Prohibition-era Chicago, few men hated each other more than George, Bugs, Moran, and Al Capone. Their feud painted the city in blood, and its echo still defines the gangster era. Born Adelard Cunin in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1891, Moran grew up Catholic, restless, and quick to fight. He drifted into crime early, landing in and out of jail before he ever turned 20. When he finally made his way to Chicago, he found a city where a man with nerve could make a fortune if he could survive long enough. By the 1920s, Moran had become the head of the North Side Gang, inheriting control after a series of bloody hits wiped out his predecessors, including Dean O'Banion and Jaime Weiss. Under Moran's command, the gang controlled bootlegging routes across the north side of the city, smuggling liquor from Canada and selling it in speakeasies across Chicago. On the other side of town stood Al Capone and his Chicago outfit, richer, better connected, and far more ruthless. The two men were locked in a war for control of the city's illegal liquor trade. Moran's crew ambushed and killed several of Capone's men, and the violence spiraled. Each hit demanded another. Then came February 14th, 1929, the day that sealed both their legacies. That morning, Moran's men arrived at a garage on North Clark Street, expecting a routine liquor delivery. Instead, they were met by 4 men, 2 dressed as police officers, 2 in street clothes. The imposters ordered Moran's men to line up against the wall. Seconds later, the room exploded in gunfire. When it was over, 7 of Moran's associates lay dead. Moran himself escaped by pure luck, arriving late and spotting the police from down the street before ducking away. The world called it the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And though no one was ever convicted, the message was clear. This was Capone's revenge. The massacre broke the back of the North Side gang. Moran's influence faded as Capone's empire grew. When Prohibition ended in 1933, Moran was finished as a major player. He drifted into small-time robberies, a once powerful boss reduced to petty heists. In 1946, he was arrested for robbing a bank messenger and sentenced to prison. He spent his final years behind bars, sick and forgotten. On February 25, 1957, George "Bugs" Moran died of lung cancer in Leavenworth Penitentiary, the last survivor of Chicago's Prohibition Wars. He had once gone to war with Al Capone for control of a city. In the end, he died quietly in a cell, another casualty of a time when bullets, not ballots, decided who ruled Chicago's streets. He was charming when he wanted to be, but beneath that charm was a man born for violence. His name was Fred Barker, and by the 1930s, he had become one of the most feared outlaws in America. Born in 1891 in Aurora, Missouri, Fred was one of the infamous Barker brothers, sons of a tough, domineering matriarch named Kate "Ma" Barker. The family lived poor, moved often, and learned early that crime paid faster than hard work. By his 20s, Fred had already done time for robbery and assault, drifting in and out of prison like it was home. But Fred wasn't alone in his life of crime. Along with Alvin Karpis, a cold, calculating thief from Canada, he founded what the press would later call the Barker-Karpis Gang, a crew that terrorized the Midwest through bank robberies, kidnappings, and murders during the early 1930s. Karpis would later describe Fred as a natural-born killer, a man whose first instinct was always to reach for his gun. Together, the 2 men pulled off a string of daring robberies across Kansas, Minnesota, and Missouri, often leaving bodies in their wake. As federal law enforcement grew stronger under J. Edgar Hoover, the Barker-Karpis gang became a top priority for the FBI. After several high-profile kidnappings, including that of Minnesota banker Edward Bremer, Hoover labeled the Barkers public enemies and ordered an all-out manhunt. Fred tried to stay ahead of the chase. In a desperate attempt to disguise himself, he underwent plastic surgery to change his face and even had his fingerprints altered. But nothing could hide him for long. By January 1935, agents had traced him and his mother, Ma Barker, to a small, 2-story lake house near Ocklawaha, Florida. At dawn on January the 16th, the FBI surrounded the property and demanded their surrender. What followed was one of the longest shootouts in FBI history, more than 4 hours of gunfire echoing across the lake. When it was over, both Fred and Ma Barker were dead. Inside the house, agents found rifles, pistols, and thousands of rounds of ammunition scattered among the furniture. Fred Barker's outlaw career ended the same way it had been lived, violent, defiant, and without mercy. He was 33 years old, a man who could never outrun the blood on his hands, nor the law that had finally caught up to him. By the time the 1950s arrived, the golden age of the Depression-era outlaw was all but over. The old names, Dillinger, Nelson, Kelly, were long dead or locked away. But one man, Fred William Bowerman, refused to let the legend die quietly. Born in 1903, Bowerman came of age during the chaos of the Great Depression, when banks were seen as the enemy and guns were the only way out. He spent his life moving from one town to the next, robbing banks across the Midwest. He was careful, methodical, and ruthless when he needed to be. For 2 decades, Bowerman stayed ahead of the law, robbing small banks, disappearing into back roads, and resurfacing only when another job called for his particular skill. But by the early 1950s, age and desperation were catching up with him. In 1953, Bowerman pulled off a heist bold enough to land him on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, a distinction reserved for the most dangerous fugitives in America. Rather than lay low, he planned another robbery, one that would make his name echo among the outlaws he admired. On May 24, 1953, Bowerman and 3 accomplices stormed the Southwest Bank in St. Louis, Missouri. They came in fast, armed, and confident. The customers froze. The tellers filled their bags. Everything was going according to plan except for one small detail they hadn't noticed. A bank employee had pressed a silent alarm. Within minutes, the streets outside filled with police officers, more than 100 of them. The building was surrounded. What followed was chaos. Bullets shattering glass, sirens echoing down the block, terrified hostages caught in the crossfire. Bowerman and his men tried to fight their way out, but there was no escape. In the hail of gunfire that followed, Fred William Bowerman was shot and killed inside the bank he'd tried to rob. His accomplices were captured soon after. It was the end of the last great holdout from the outlaw generation, a man who refused to believe the world had changed and who died chasing the kind of fame that had already disappeared. Fred Bowerman had spent a lifetime running from the law. In the end, the law was waiting for him at the door. He was called the Dean of American Bank Robbers, a title that spoke not to recklessness, but to mastery. Harvey John Bailey wasn't a flashy outlaw or a killer by nature. He was a professional, one of the most disciplined thieves of his time. Born in 1887 in Texas, Bailey came from a generation that watched America shift from frontier towns to modern cities. By the early 1920s, as Prohibition turned crime into big business, Bailey found his place among the new class of organized bandits, men who treated robbery like a trade. He was calm under pressure, efficient, and always planned his jobs with precision. Over a span of 12 years, Bailey was said to have robbed at least 2 banks a year, hitting targets from Kansas to Ohio. He never lingered, never boasted, and rarely left a clue. Among fellow outlaws, he was respected as a craftsman, quiet, methodical, and fair in dividing the take. But as the 1930s arrived, the heat was rising. The FBI was expanding under J. Edgar Hoover, and men like Bailey were running out of road. The big jobs drew too much attention, and the safe houses that once offered refuge were vanishing fast. In 1933, Bailey's luck finally broke. He was accused of helping George Machine Gun Kelly and Albert Bates in the kidnapping of oil tycoon Charles F. Urschel, one of the most famous abductions of the era. Though his exact role in the crime remains debated, the courts made their decision clear. Bailey was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. He served his time quietly, moving through various federal facilities, including the infamous Leavenworth Penitentiary. As the decades passed, the world outside changed. The old gangsters were gone and the age of the outlaw had ended. In 1964, after more than 30 years behind bars, Harvey Bailey was released on parole. He was 77 years old. He returned to civilian life with no taste for fame or violence. Instead, he took up cabinet making, working with wood instead of dynamite, shaping things instead of breaking them. When he died in 1979, at the age of 91, he was remembered as the last of the old professionals, a man from an era when crime was conducted with planning, precision, and, in his own way, a kind of order. Harvey Bailey had been called the Dean for a reason. He wasn't the loudest, the bloodiest, or the richest. He was the one who lived long enough to walk away. He was wild, restless, and loyal to the wrong men. A career outlaw whose life burned out as fast as it rose. His name was Homer Van Meter, and for a short time in the early 1930s, he was one of the most wanted men in America. Born in 1905 in Fort Wayne, Indiana, Van Meter grew up in the same kind of hard times that bred many of the Depression-era bandits. He started small, petty thefts, burglaries, a few stick-ups, but prison hardened him. By his early 20s, he was already an experienced thief with nothing left to lose. When he crossed paths with John Dillinger, his life changed forever. Van Meter joined Dillinger's crew, a group of charismatic and violent outlaws who turned bank robbery into a kind of dark theater. They hit banks across the Midwest, Indiana, Ohio, and Minnesota, moving fast, living faster, and leaving bodies behind when things went wrong. Van Meter was smooth and sharp-tongued, the kind of man who smiled even in the middle of a gunfight. He was also close with another dangerous name of the time, George Babyface Nelson. Together, the three men became the face of America's crime wave, robbing banks with military precision and embarrassing local law enforcement with every escape. But as 1934 wore on, the walls began to close. The FBI was learning, and the once glamorous public enemies were now hunted day and night. After Dillinger was killed outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago that July, Van Meter and Nelson kept running, stealing cars, changing hideouts, and trusting fewer people with every mile. By August 1934, Van Meter was on his own and desperate. Rumors swirled that he and Nelson had been fighting over money, over loyalty, over survival. Some would later whisper that Nelson himself tipped off the law to get Van Meter out of the way. Whatever the truth, it ended on August 23, 1934 in St. Paul, Minnesota. Acting on a tip, police cornered Van Meter near a warehouse on Marion Street. He tried to run, but officers opened fire. The chase lasted seconds. When it was over, Homer Van Meter lay dead in the street, 29 years old, his revolver still in his hand. For a man who lived by the gun, it was the only ending that ever made sense. Homer Van Meter had spent his life chasing the fast money and the fleeting fame that came with it. In the end, like Dillinger and Nelson before him, he found what every outlaw eventually does, that there's no easy way out of a life on the run. He was called Joe the Boss, a man whose power once stretched across New York's underworld, and whose death would help shape the American mafia for generations to come. His real name was Giuseppe Masseria, and in the years after World War I, he was the most feared mob boss in the city. Masseria was born in Sicily in 1886 and came to America as a young man, settling on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, where hundreds of Sicilian immigrants were carving out their own version of the old country. There, loyalty and violence went hand in hand. Masseria learned quickly that to survive in that world, you had to command both. By the early 1920s, Masseria had taken control of what would later become the Genovese crime family, running gambling, extortion, and bootlegging rackets across Manhattan. His confidence and his uncanny ability to survive assassination attempts earned him the nickname the man who can dodge bullets. But Masseria's ambitions stretched beyond the city. He wanted to be the undisputed boss of all Italian organized crime in America. That hunger for power set him on a collision course with another rising figure, Salvatore Maranzano, an old-world Sicilian with his own vision for control. Their feud exploded into what the newspapers called the Castellammarese War, a brutal two-year conflict from 1929 to 1931 that pitted faction against faction and left bodies in alleys from Brooklyn to the Bronx. Both sides lost men, money, and influence, while younger mobsters watched from the sidelines, waiting for their chance to end the chaos. Among those younger men were Charles Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese, both of whom served under Masseria but were growing tired of his leadership. They saw that endless bloodshed was bad for business, and that the future of organized crime lay in cooperation, not tradition. Luciano made his move in the spring of 1931. On April 15th, he met Masseria for lunch at Nuova Villa Tamaro, a small restaurant in Coney Island, Brooklyn. The two men ate, drank wine, and played cards. When Luciano excused himself to use the restroom, gunmen entered the room and opened fire. When the smoke cleared, Joe Masseria was dead, slumped over the table, a playing card still in his hand. His murder ended the Castellammarese War. Within months, Maranzano would take power, and soon after, he too would be eliminated, clearing the way for Luciano to build the Commission, the governing body that defined the modern American mafia. Joe, the boss, Masseria, had ruled through fear and force. But his death proved a larger truth. In organized crime, the throne never stays warm for long, and every bullet dodged only brings the next one closer. Before there was Al Capone, there was Johnny Torrio, the man who built the empire Capone would one day rule. They called him Papa Johnny, a title earned not through fear but through the kind of quiet intelligence that made him one of the true architects of organized crime in America. Born Giovanni Torrio in Italy in 1882, he came to New York as a child and grew up in the crowded streets of the Lower East Side. While most gangsters of his generation relied on muscle, Torrio relied on strategy. He understood that violence was only useful when it protected profit. By the early 1910s, Torrio was working with Brooklyn's underworld elite, including a young Charles "Lucky" Luciano. But opportunity called from the Midwest. Torrio moved to Chicago to help his uncle by marriage, Big Jim Colosimo, run his chain of brothels and gambling dens. When Prohibition arrived in 1920, Torrio saw what few others did, that the illegal liquor trade would become the most profitable business in America. When Colosimo refused to join the bootlegging game, Torrio made a decision that would define his career. Colosimo was killed in 1920, and Torrio took over his operation, turning it into what would become the Chicago outfit. To help him run it, Torrio brought in a trusted protege from Brooklyn, Alphonse Capone. Together they built a criminal empire fueled by bootleg beer, speakeasies, and bribery. Torrio kept the violence to a minimum and the money flowing freely. Under his rule, Chicago's underworld became a business, organized, efficient, and profitable. But power attracts bullets. In 1925, after years of rising gang wars, Torrio was ambushed outside his home by rivals from the North Side Gang, led by George "Bugs" Moran. He was shot several times but survived barely. The attack changed him. From his hospital bed, Torrio made a decision few mob bosses ever did. He retired. He handed control of the outfit to Capone, packed his bags, and quietly left Chicago. Torrio spent the rest of his life moving through legitimate ventures, real estate, investments, and consulting work that sometimes still brushed up against organized crime. Even after leaving the streets, his influence lingered. Men like Luciano and Lansky would later credit him with inspiring the structure of the Commission, the national governing body of the Mafia. On April 16, 1957, while sitting in a barber's chair in Brooklyn, Johnny Torrio suffered a heart attack and died at the age of 75. He left behind no empire and no sensational headlines, only a legacy. Torrio had shown that crime could be run like a business, that power didn't always come from the gun in your hand, but from the mind that knew when to put it down. They called him Gentleman Jack, but there was nothing gentle about him. To the underworld, he was Jack Legs Diamond, a bootlegger, a killer, and a man who seemed impossible to kill. Born John Diamond in Philadelphia in 1897, he came from an Irish immigrant family that never had much but always fought to get by. As a young man, Diamond drifted into crime early, petty theft, stick-ups, and eventually bootlegging, once Prohibition made liquor the most valuable commodity in America. By the 1920s, he was running alcohol smuggling operations across Philadelphia and New York City, moving whiskey by the truckload and building a reputation as both a businessman and a menace. He dressed sharp, moved fast, and lived loud, a gangster who loved the spotlight almost as much as the money. Diamond's operations brought him into conflict with other mob figures, including Dutch Schultz and the rising Italian syndicates who wanted his territory. But while most men in his position ended up in the morgue, Diamond had a habit of surviving. He was shot, beaten, and ambushed again and again. Once he took a bullet to the head and walked out of the hospital days later, smiling for reporters. Another time he was riddled with rounds outside an Albany hotel and lived to tell the tale. The press began calling him the clay pigeon of the underworld, a man everyone took shots at, but who somehow kept getting back up. But luck has a way of running out, even for men like Legs Diamond. By 1931, his enemies had multiplied and his charm had worn thin. His crew was fractured and the law was closing in. On the night of December 18th, 1931, after being acquitted on kidnapping charges, Diamond returned to a small boarding house in Albany, New York, to sleep off a long celebration. In the early hours of the morning, gunmen slipped into his room and opened fire. Diamond was hit 3 times, once in the head. This time, there was no miracle recovery. Jack Legs Diamond was dead at 34. No one was ever charged, but few doubted who was behind it. The gangsters he'd crossed, the crooked politicians he'd embarrassed, they'd all had reasons. In the end, the man who could survive anything finally met the only certainty his world ever offered. He had lived fast, loved fame, and died as violently as he'd lived. A gentleman only in name and a legend born from the echo of his own gunfire. He was small, quiet, and always impeccably dressed. The kind of man you might pass on a New York sidewalk without a second glance. But behind that calm exterior, Louis Lepke Buchalter ran one of the deadliest operations in organized crime. Born in 1897 on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, Buchalter grew up in the poverty and chaos that raised so many future gangsters. His nickname, Lepke, came from the Yiddish word for Little Louis. But there was nothing small about his ambition. By the time he reached his 20s, Buchalter had built a reputation as a racketeer, muscling his way into labor unions, extorting factory owners, and controlling entire industries through fear and violence. He was smart, calculating, and always careful to stay a few steps removed from the bloodshed his orders caused. In the early 1930s, Buchalter teamed up with Albert Anastasia, the brutal Sicilian enforcer who ruled Brooklyn's underworld. Together, they oversaw the mafia's enforcement arm, a group of hired killers that the press would later call Murder, Inc. Operating out of candy stores and back rooms in Brownsville, Brooklyn, Murder, Inc. carried out assassinations for the National Crime Syndicate, enforcing rules and silencing witnesses coast to coast. It's estimated that the organization committed hundreds of murders, and nearly everyone could be traced back to Buchalter's command. But power in the underworld always comes with a price. By the late 1930s, the law was closing in. The government wanted to prove that the mafia's leadership wasn't untouchable, and Buchalter became their target. In 1941, after years on the run and a string of indictments, Louis Buchalter was convicted of murder, accused of ordering the killing of a Brooklyn businessman who refused to pay protection money. The verdict made history. Buchalter became the only major American crime boss ever sentenced to death. While his old partner Anastasia continued to thrive in the mafia hierarchy, Buchalter spent the next years fighting appeals from a death row cell at Sing Sing prison. He maintained his composure to the end, calm, polite, and convinced that his influence could somehow save him. It didn't. On March 4, 1944, Louis Lepke Buchalter was executed in the electric chair the same night as two of his Murder, Inc. gunmen. Witnesses said he faced his death without a word. He had built an empire on fear and control, but in the end, his power couldn't buy him another minute. Louis Buchalter's execution sent a message through every corner of organized crime. Even the men who ordered the hits could one day face the same fate as their victims. He had a cold grin that never reached his eyes, the kind of smile that earned him his nickname, Creepy. His real name was Alvin Karpis, and for a time in the 1930s, he was America's most dangerous outlaw. Born Alvin Francis Karpovitz in Montreal, Canada, in 1907, he grew up in the industrial towns of the Midwest, where poverty and crime were often two sides of the same coin. By his teens, he was already running with small-time thieves, learning how to crack safes, steal cars, and disappear before sunrise. By the early 1930s, Karpis had partnered with Fred Barker and the infamous Ma Barker, forming what would become the Barker-Karpis Gang, a crew so violent and unpredictable that even other criminals steered clear of them. Together, they robbed banks, hijacked shipments, and murdered anyone who stood in their way. But it was kidnapping that brought them national fame and sealed their fate. In 1933, the gang abducted William Ham Jr., a wealthy Minnesota brewer, and later Edward Bremer, the son of a prominent St. Paul banker. Both men were released unharmed after massive ransoms were paid, but those crimes made the Barker-Karpis gang the FBI's top priority. By 1934, after the deaths of John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, and Pretty Boy Floyd, Karpis stood alone at the top of the Bureau's list. J. Edgar Hoover himself labeled him public enemy number one. Karpis stayed ahead of the law longer than most, moving from state to state under false names, constantly shifting hideouts. But in 1936, his luck finally ran out. Federal agents cornered him in New Orleans, where he was preparing another escape. When the arrest came, Hoover was there in person, eager for the spotlight. As agents surrounded the car, Karpis surrendered without a fight. The moment became legend. Alvin Karpis was the only criminal ever personally arrested by J. Edgar Hoover. Karpis was sentenced to life in prison, spending decades behind bars in some of America's toughest facilities, including Alcatraz, where he became one of its longest-serving inmates. He was finally paroled in 1969 after more than 30 years in confinement. He moved to Canada, then to Spain, living quietly under the radar, a relic of a bygone era. On August 26, 1979, Alvin "Creepy" Karpis was found dead in his apartment in Torremolinos, Spain. He was 72. The official cause was suicide, though like so many things in his life, the details remain uncertain. He was the last of the Depression-era outlaws, a man who outlived them all but never escaped the shadow of the world he'd helped define. He was young, handsome, and dangerous. A man the papers called Pretty Boy Floyd, though he hated the name. To some, he was a killer. To others, he was a hero, the Robin Hood of the Cookson Hills. Born Charles Arthur Floyd in Georgia in 1904, he grew up poor, one of many sons of struggling tenant farmers. The hard times shaped him early. When the oil boom hit Oklahoma, Floyd chased work and found crime instead. By his 20s, he was robbing banks across the Midwest, fast with a gun, and faster behind the wheel of a getaway car. But Floyd was different from most outlaws. He didn't rob for fame or greed, at least not entirely. In the towns he hit, people whispered stories of him burning mortgage papers during his heists, freeing desperate families from crushing debt. Whether true or not, the legend stuck. Locals hid him, fed him, and refused to speak to the law. In Oklahoma, he became less a criminal and more a symbol. A poor man's outlaw in an age when the rich still had everything. Still, the truth was darker. Floyd's robberies were violent, his temper short, and his enemies many. By 1933, his name was on the FBI's most wanted list. That year, his world turned bloody at an event that would haunt his legend, the Kansas City Massacre. On June 17, 1933, federal agents and police officers were transferring escaped convict Frank "Jelly" Nash at Union Station in Kansas City, Missouri. Suddenly, gunmen opened fire in a bid to free Nash. When the smoke cleared, Nash was dead along with 2 police officers, a police chief, and an FBI agent. Though Floyd's involvement was never proven, the Bureau branded him responsible. Overnight, he went from folk hero to hunted fugitive. For more than a year, Floyd eluded capture, hiding among the hills and back roads of Oklahoma, helped by families who still saw him as one of their own. But by the fall of 1934, his luck ran out. On October 22, 1934, near East Liverpool, Ohio, agents and local police finally cornered him in a cornfield. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say Floyd reached for his gun, others that he was already wounded. Either way, when the shooting stopped, Pretty Boy Floyd lay dead, his body riddled with bullets. He was 30 years old. The Bureau called it justice. The people of Oklahoma called it tragedy. Charles Pretty Boy Floyd was buried in Aikens, Oklahoma, where thousands came to pay their respects. To the law, he was a criminal. To the poor farmers who lived through the Depression, he was something else. A man who struck back at the system and who died standing in the same dirt he came from.